Keep your hands where they belong, the flight attendant snapped, her voice slicing through the quiet cabin with the kind of certainty that only comes from believing no one would ever challenge her. Every conversation stopped. Crystal glasses remained untouched. Even the low hum of the engines seemed to fade beneath the weight of that single accusation. Then came the sharp sound of a hand striking against another, brief but unmistakable, leaving the entire cabin frozen in disbelief. No one moved. No one spoke. 39,000 feet above the Atlantic, inside one of the most luxurious private jets in American aviation, every eye turned toward the woman who had just been humiliated. She did not raise her voice. She did not step forward. She simply looked at the flight attendant with calm, steady eyes that carried neither fear nor anger, only disappointment. Heather Collins, the senior cabin attendant, folded her arms as though she had just restored order. "I warned you not to touch anything reserved for authorized personnel," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "This aircraft has rules, and those rules apply to everyone." A businessman seated across the aisle lowered his newspaper. An elderly couple exchanged uncertain glances. Two executives near the rear cabin quietly removed their headphones, sensing they had just witnessed the beginning of something neither training manuals nor company policies could explain. Heather interpreted the silence as support. She straightened her navy blazer, adjusted the gold wings pinned above her pocket, and continued with growing confidence. "People can pretend to belong anywhere these days," she said. "Not on my flight." The woman standing before her remained perfectly still. She wore dark jeans, clean white sneakers, and a charcoal sweater without a designer logo in sight. Her hair rested neatly against her shoulders, untouched by extravagance. There was no diamond necklace, no luxury handbag, no visible security detail. She looked like someone who preferred comfort over attention, and that ordinary appearance had already convinced Heather she knew exactly who she was dealing with. What Heather never considered was that appearances often reveal more about the observer than the person being observed. The woman quietly picked up the leather notebook that had slipped onto the seat beside her and brushed away a faint crease with careful fingers. Her breathing remained even. Years earlier, moments like this might have demanded a response fueled by emotion. Experience had taught her something different. Calm, unsettled arrogance far more effectively than outrage ever could. Across the aisle, a young charter coordinator named Emily Foster watched with growing concern. She had boarded only 20 minutes earlier, carrying updated passenger paperwork that included a document marked owner authorization. She remembered seeing a name before sliding the file into the cockpit briefing folder, but with boarding moving quickly, she had never looked twice. Now, something about the composed woman standing in front of Heather stirred that forgotten memory. Emily glanced toward the cockpit door, then back toward the passenger whose expression had never changed. Heather took one deliberate step closer. "I asked you a simple question," she declared. "Who gave you permission to be here?" The woman finally lifted her eyes and met Heather's stare without the slightest trace of intimidation. The cabin seemed to hold its breath, suspended somewhere between accusation and truth, while 8 quiet minutes began counting down toward a revelation that would permanently change every career on board that aircraft. The woman answered with a voice so calm that it almost seemed out of place inside a cabin filled with rising tension. "No one gave me permission," she said. "I already have it." Heather gave a short laugh, the kind that invited agreement from everyone within earshot. "Confidence is not authorization," she replied. "This aircraft is reserved for executives and approved guests only." The woman simply nodded once, as if she had heard variations of those words throughout her life. She reached for the seat beside her and carefully placed her notebook back into its leather sleeve before resting both hands in front of her. There was no attempt to argue, no demand for respect, no effort to prove herself to strangers who had already formed an opinion. That quiet composure unsettled Emily even more than the confrontation itself. She remembered the boarding process with surprising clarity. Every passenger had been verified through the charter manifest before departure from Teterboro Airport outside New York City. No one entered the aircraft without multiple levels of clearance. If this woman had made it through every checkpoint, then someone had approved her presence long before Heather ever welcomed passengers aboard. Emily's heartbeat quickened. She excused herself without drawing attention and stepped toward the forward galley where the printed manifest rested inside a navy folder. Before she could reach for it, Heather noticed the movement. "Emily," she called firmly. "Stay here. We are handling a security concern." Emily hesitated. "I only wanted to confirm something." Heather answered before she could continue. "There is nothing to confirm." Several passengers exchanged uncertain looks. A technology investor seated near the conference table quietly closed his laptop. Across from him, a retired federal judge studied the scene with careful eyes, saying nothing but missing nothing. The atmosphere inside the elegant cabin had shifted from relaxed luxury to quiet examination. Every decision now carried weight. The woman slowly looked through one of the oval windows. Morning sunlight reflected across endless clouds stretching beneath the aircraft like fresh snow. For a brief moment her thoughts drifted somewhere far away. 22 years earlier, she had stood inside a regional airport wearing a simple business suit, holding a presentation that represented every dollar she had managed to save. A gate agent had assumed she belonged in the wrong boarding group without ever checking her ticket. She remembered walking away that day promising herself that success would never erase moments like those. Instead, they would become the reason she built companies where dignity mattered as much as profit. The memory disappeared as quickly as it arrived. She returned her attention to the cabin with the same steady expression. Heather interpreted the silence as resistance. "I need your identification," she demanded. Immediately, the woman looked directly at her. "You already have everything you need." Heather frowned. "Then why are you making this difficult?" The answer came without hesitation. "I am not the one making it difficult." Those words lingered in the air. Emily could no longer ignore the growing certainty in her mind. She quietly stepped toward the cockpit entrance anyway, hoping to verify the manifest before another mistake was made. She never noticed that the digital flight clock above the cabin display had just marked the beginning of the 7th minute, leaving very little time before the truth reached everyone on board. Emily reached the cockpit door before a calm voice stopped her. Captain Daniel Mercer stepped into the aisle, his crisp uniform carrying the quiet authority of thousands of flight hours. He glanced from Heather to the woman standing beside the conference table, then back again. "What is happening?" he asked. Heather answered before anyone else could speak. She ignored crew instructions, entered a restricted area, and refused to provide identification. "I believe she should be confined to her assigned seat until we land." Daniel looked toward the woman. "Is that accurate?" She met his eyes without hesitation. "No, none of it is." The simplicity of the answer unsettled him more than an emotional denial would have. He had spent decades reading people under pressure. Fear usually spoke loudly. Deception often arrived with too many details. This woman offered neither. She simply stood there with the confidence of someone who had nothing to hide. Heather folded her arms again. "Captain, we cannot allow passengers to challenge cabin authority. If we let this continue, everyone else will think the rules are optional." Daniel slowly nodded, accepting her explanation without asking another question. That single decision shifted the balance inside the aircraft. Several passengers who had quietly questioned the situation moments earlier now watched with growing concern. The retired judge leaned toward the businessman across the aisle and whispered, "Authority should verify facts before reaching conclusions." The businessman gave a slight nod but remained silent. Emily could no longer stay quiet. "Captain," she said carefully, "I believe we should check the owner manifest before taking any further action." Heather turned sharply. "Emily, enough. You are still in training. Stay within your responsibilities." Emily felt every pair of eyes move toward her, yet something stronger than embarrassment kept her standing. "I remember seeing her name during boarding." Heather dismissed the statement with a wave of her hand. "You remember incorrectly." The woman remained remarkably composed. She slowly picked up a glass of sparkling water from the table beside her, took a small sip, and placed it back exactly where it had been. Every movement seemed deliberate, almost as though she refused to let someone else's behavior dictate her own. Daniel watched her closely. There was something unusual about the way she carried herself. She never looked around for approval. She never searched the cabin for sympathy. She behaved as though she understood the outcome long before anyone else did. Heather interpreted that confidence as arrogance. "Captain, I recommend we collect her electronic devices until this situation is resolved," she said. "If necessary, we can notify corporate security after landing." The woman finally spoke again. "That will not be necessary." Heather smiled thinly. "You are not the one making that decision." For the first time since the confrontation began, a faint expression crossed the woman's face. It was not anger. It was disappointment, the kind reserved for people who continued walking toward a cliff after every warning had already been given. She reached into the pocket of her charcoal sweater and removed a simple smartphone without a jeweled case or luxury logo. Heather immediately stepped forward. "Do not make any calls until the captain authorizes it." The woman glanced briefly at the illuminated screen before locking it again. "I was hoping you would give yourselves one last opportunity to correct this," she said quietly. "But I can see that opportunity has passed." A heavy silence settled over the cabin. Somewhere beneath the polished wood finishes, soft leather seats, and polished chrome fixtures, the aircraft continued crossing the Atlantic at more than 500 miles per hour. Inside, however, time seemed to slow. No one realized that the 8th minute was drawing closer, and with it the moment when assumptions would collide with the truth in a way none of them would ever forget. Emily could not ignore the feeling any longer. While Heather continued watching the woman with unwavering suspicion, Emily quietly stepped toward the cockpit entrance once again. This time she moved with purpose instead of hesitation. She knew exactly where the owner manifest had been placed before departure. It was inside the Navy briefing folder resting on the side console, just behind Captain Daniel Mercer. "Captain," she asked carefully, "may I verify the passenger file before we take another step?" Daniel hesitated for only a moment before Heather answered for him. "There is no reason to waste time on paperwork. We already know what is happening." Emily looked directly at the captain. "Respectfully, sir, we do not know. We believe." Those words settled over the cabin with surprising weight. The retired judge slowly removed his reading glasses and watched the exchange with renewed interest. The technology investor leaned forward in his seat, no longer pretending to review financial reports on his tablet. Even the flight engineer who had quietly stepped into the galley remained perfectly still, sensing the atmosphere had shifted once again. Daniel finally nodded. "Bring me the manifest." Heather immediately objected. "Captain, this is unnecessary." "Bring it anyway," he repeated. Emily disappeared into the cockpit and returned less than 30 seconds later carrying the Navy folder against her chest. She opened it carefully, turning one page after another until she reached the final passenger authorization sheet. Her eyes stopped instantly. The same name she had remembered during boarding appeared in bold letters near the top of the page, followed by a designation she had never seen assigned to an ordinary traveler. She looked up in disbelief before lowering her eyes to read it again, making certain she had not imagined it. Heather noticed the change in Emily's expression. "What is it?" she demanded. Emily swallowed quietly. "Captain, I think you should read this yourself." Daniel accepted the document and scanned the page. His expression remained neutral, but his eyes slowed as they reached the highlighted authorization line. Before he could continue reading, Heather stepped closer and spoke with growing impatience. "Surely one clerical mistake is not going to change what we all witnessed." The woman standing near the conference table finally turned toward Emily. There was a gentle appreciation in her eyes, not because Emily had recognized her name, but because someone had chosen facts over assumptions. Emily returned the look with quiet uncertainty. She still did not know exactly who this passenger was, but she knew one thing beyond doubt. Heather's version of events no longer matched the documents resting in the captain's hands. One of the executives seated near the rear cabin broke the silence. Perhaps introductions should have come before accusations. Heather ignored him completely. "Captain, we have procedures. If passengers refuse instructions, the crew cannot appear weak." The woman answered before Daniel could speak. "Strength is not measured by how loudly authority speaks. It is measured by how willingly it listens." No one responded. Those words seemed to linger in every corner of the cabin. Daniel looked from the manifest to the woman, then back to the document once more. The aircraft continued its smooth course across the Atlantic. Yet inside the cabin something far more significant had begun to change. Doubt had entered the room, and once doubt replaced certainty, the foundation beneath Heather's confidence started to crack in ways she still could not see. Daniel continued reading the manifest in complete silence. The longer his eyes remained on the page, the less certain he appeared. Heather noticed the hesitation and stepped closer before he could finish. "Captain, paperwork can be corrected later," she insisted. "Right now we need to maintain order in this cabin." Without waiting for permission, she reached toward the leather notebook resting beside the woman and slid it across the conference table. Until we verify everything, personal business materials should remain secured. The woman did not resist. She simply watched Heather move the notebook away with the same calm expression she had worn from the beginning. That composure unsettled everyone except the person who needed to recognize it most. Heather mistook patience for surrender. "You see," she said confidently, turning toward the passengers. "People cooperate when they understand the rules." No one answered. The retired judge lowered his gaze for a moment, then quietly said, "Real authority is never afraid of verification." Heather ignored him completely. Emily stood frozen beside the captain, still unable to take her eyes off the owner designation printed on the manifest. She had reviewed hundreds of charter documents during training, yet she had never seen that level of clearance attached to an ordinary traveler. Her pulse quickened. She wanted to speak, but every attempt seemed to disappear beneath Heather's increasingly forceful confidence. The woman slowly folded her hands together. The polished wood walls, soft cream leather seats, and gentle cabin lighting faded from her thoughts for a brief moment as another memory returned without invitation. More than 20 years earlier, she had walked into a corporate aviation conference carrying a presentation that would eventually become the foundation of her first successful company. Before she reached the registration desk, someone had assumed she was part of the catering staff and directed her toward a service entrance without asking a single question. She remembered standing there in silence, holding months of preparation in her hands while strangers decided who she must be based only on appearance. That day she made herself a promise. She would build organizations where respect was given before status was known. The memory disappeared as quietly as it had arrived. She returned her attention to the present with the same steady breathing. "Captain," she said gently, "you still have time to let facts lead this conversation." Daniel looked up from the manifest. For the first time since boarding, uncertainty replaced confidence in his expression. Before he could respond, Heather stepped directly between them. "We have delayed this long enough," she declared. "If she refuses to identify herself the proper way, corporate security can deal with it after landing." Emily finally found her voice. She already identified herself before departure. Otherwise, she could not have boarded. Heather turned sharply toward her. "Emily, stop defending someone you do not know." Emily answered quietly but firmly. "That is exactly why I want us to verify before we judge." Those words settled over the cabin like a slow-moving storm. Several passengers nodded almost imperceptibly. The businessman near the window closed his briefcase and said, "I believe everyone here would appreciate the truth more than assumptions." The woman reached into her sweater pocket once again and looked briefly at her silent phone. The display illuminated for only a second before fading to black. She smiled almost invisibly, as though an unseen clock had reached the exact moment she had been expecting. 8 minutes had nearly passed, and somewhere far beyond the cabin walls, decisions were already being set into motion. The woman unlocked her phone without urgency and scrolled through a handful of messages before selecting a single contact, saved only as Rachel. She waited less than 2 seconds before the call connected. "Good morning," a composed voice answered. "Good morning, Rachel," the woman replied. "Please activate owner protocol." There was no dramatic explanation, no raised voice, no complaint. Rachel simply responded, "Understood. Verification has already begun. You should receive confirmation shortly." The call ended after less than 15 seconds. Heather let out a quiet laugh that carried more confidence than caution. "Owner protocol," she repeated. "That is creative." A few passengers glanced at one another, unsure whether they had just witnessed an empty bluff or something far more significant. The woman slipped the phone back into her pocket and returned to the same relaxed posture she had maintained from the beginning. Daniel still held the manifest in his hands, reading the authorization line again as though he hoped the words would somehow change. They did not. Emily noticed his expression becoming more unsettled with every passing second. "Captain," she said softly, "there is also an emergency contact number listed beneath the authorization." Daniel lowered his eyes to the bottom of the page. There it was, printed beneath the owner's information in bold lettering. Before he could decide whether to place the call, The cockpit communication panel chimed with a distinctive priority tone that none of the passengers recognized, but every crew member immediately understood. The first officer opened the cockpit door. "Captain," he said quietly, "Operations is requesting you on the secure channel immediately." Daniel frowned. "Did they say why?" "No, sir. They marked it as executive priority." Heather's confident expression flickered for the first time. Executive priority communications were extremely rare during a routine transatlantic flight. Daniel stepped into the cockpit carrying the manifest while the cabin remained wrapped in tense silence. Heather folded her arms again, determined not to let uncertainty show. "This changes nothing," she declared, looking toward the passengers instead of the woman. "Corporate offices receive all kinds of calls." No one responded. The retired judge continued watching with patient curiosity. The technology investor quietly checked the expensive watch on his wrist, noticing that only a few minutes had passed since the confrontation began. Somehow it felt much longer. Emily stood beside the galley, unable to ignore the growing realization that every assumption made since boarding had rested on appearance instead of evidence. She looked toward the woman, who seemed remarkably peaceful despite everything that had happened. "Are you worried?" Emily asked almost in a whisper. The woman smiled gently. "No, I am waiting." "Waiting for what?" Emily asked. "For everyone else to catch up with the truth." Before Emily could answer, the cockpit door opened again. Daniel stepped into the cabin with noticeably different body language. His shoulders had lost their earlier certainty, and the color had faded slightly from his face. He looked first at the woman, then at Heather, then down at the manifest still resting in his hands. Behind him, the first officer remained unusually still, saying nothing but carefully observing every reaction inside the cabin. Heather took one confident step forward. "Captain, I assume operations confirmed we should continue standard procedure." Daniel did not answer immediately. Instead, he took a slow breath as though choosing every word with extraordinary care. The silence stretched across the cabin until it became impossible to ignore. For the first time since the aircraft left New Jersey, Heather's certainty no longer filled the room. Something much stronger had arrived, and everyone on board could feel it approaching before a single word had been spoken. Daniel looked directly at Heather before speaking, his voice quieter than anyone expected. Operations did not call to ask about a passenger. He paused, allowing every word to settle into the silent cabin. "They called about the owner." Heather frowned with visible confusion. "The owner is not on board." Daniel slowly lifted the manifest. "According to executive operations, the owner has been on board since before we departed New Jersey." Every eye turned toward the woman standing calmly beside the conference table. She neither smiled nor celebrated. She simply waited. Heather forced a nervous laugh. "There has to be some misunderstanding." Daniel shook his head. "There is no misunderstanding." He lowered the document and took one respectful step toward the woman. "Ms. Naomi Brooks, Executive Operations has confirmed your identity. They also confirmed that this aircraft is registered under Brooks Global Aviation Holdings." The cabin fell into complete silence. The businessman who had remained skeptical throughout the confrontation slowly stood from his seat. The retired judge removed his glasses once again, this time not out of curiosity, but quiet disbelief. Emily lowered her eyes for a moment, realizing she had almost watched an extraordinary mistake become permanent. Heather stared at Naomi as though seeing her for the first time. The ordinary sweater, the simple sneakers, the notebook without a luxury logo. Everything she had interpreted as proof that Naomi did not belong now became evidence of how completely she had misunderstood the person standing in front of her. Naomi finally spoke. "Thank you, Captain." Her voice remained measured and composed. "I appreciate that you chose to verify the facts." Daniel nodded respectfully. "I should have done that much sooner." Heather struggled to regain her confidence. If this is true, why did you never say who you were?" Naomi looked at her with neither anger nor satisfaction. "Because respect should not depend on a title. If the only people treated with dignity are the ones everyone recognizes, then the problem is much larger than a single misunderstanding." No one interrupted her. Every passenger seemed to understand that the conversation had moved beyond one uncomfortable incident. Naomi continued, "When I boarded this aircraft, I wanted to travel as a passenger, not as an executive. I expected professionalism. Instead, Assumptions replaced questions before a single fact was verified. Heather's shoulders slowly dropped. The certainty that had filled her voice only minutes earlier had completely disappeared. She looked toward the passengers as though searching for someone to support her version of events, but every face reflected the same quiet realization. Emily stepped forward and gently returned the leather notebook to Naomi. "I am sorry," she said sincerely. Naomi accepted it with a grateful nod. "Thank you for choosing evidence over assumption. That decision matters more than you realize." Daniel cleared his throat. "Executive operations also informed me that owner protocol requires a complete review of every action taken during this flight." Heather closed her eyes briefly. She understood exactly what those words meant. This was no longer a disagreement inside a cabin. Every conversation, every decision, and every report would now become part of an official executive investigation. Naomi looked through the window once more as bright sunlight stretched across endless clouds below. "I did not activate owner protocol to punish anyone," she said softly. "I activated it because every employee deserves to work inside a culture where fairness comes before judgment." Today simply revealed how far we still have to go. The silence that followed carried more weight than any argument ever could, because every person on board now understood that the flight had changed from an ordinary business trip into a defining moment that none of them would ever forget. The remainder of the flight unfolded in a silence unlike anything the crew had ever experienced. Every routine announcement sounded more careful. Every movement carried greater purpose. Heather quietly returned to her assigned station, but the confidence that had defined every decision she made earlier had disappeared completely. She no longer walked through the cabin with unquestioned authority. Instead, she remained still, replaying each moment in her mind, realizing that every conclusion she had reached had begun long before she ever asked a single question. Daniel requested a secure conference with executive operations through the cockpit communication system. The response arrived within minutes. A formal review team had already been assembled before the aircraft reached its destination. All cabin recordings, operational reports, crew statements, and passenger accounts would be preserved according to company policy. No one had to speculate about what would happen next because the process had already begun. Naomi returned to her seat and quietly opened the leather notebook that Heather had removed earlier. Inside were handwritten notes for an upcoming leadership summit attended by executives from several aviation companies. Across the top of one page, she had written a single sentence in neat blue ink. "Culture is revealed by the smallest moments, not the biggest speeches." Emily noticed the words while delivering a fresh glass of sparkling water. She paused for only a second before saying, "I do not think I will ever forget today." Naomi looked up with a gentle smile. "Then make sure you remember the right lesson." Emily nodded. "Always verify before judging." Naomi smiled again. "That is one lesson. The other is even more important. Every person deserves dignity before they earn your approval." Emily quietly thanked her and returned to the galley carrying those words with her. Nearly 2 hours later, the aircraft touched down smoothly. The passengers remained seated until the engines settled into silence. Instead of rushing toward the exit, many waited. The retired judge approached Naomi first. "I have spent decades watching people exercise authority," he said. "Today I watched someone exercise restraint. That required far more strength." Naomi thanked him with quiet sincerity. The technology investor extended his hand as well. "If every company were led the way you handled this flight, business would look very different." One by one, several passengers offered similar words, not because Naomi owned the aircraft, but because she had refused to let power become pride. Outside the aircraft, a small group of senior corporate officials waited beside the stairs. Rachel stood at the front, holding a secure portfolio. Daniel exited first, removed his captain's hat, and greeted Naomi with visible respect. "Ms. Brooks," he said, "Executive Operations has instructed me to place myself fully at your disposal during the review." Naomi nodded. "Thank you, Captain. Cooperation is all I have ever asked for." Heather slowly stepped onto the stairs behind him. She stopped several feet away, unable to meet Naomi's eyes. Rachel approached calmly and handed Heather a sealed envelope bearing the company's seal. "This is formal notification," Rachel said professionally. "Effective immediately, you are being placed on administrative leave pending completion of the executive investigation." Your security credentials and flight assignments have been suspended until the review is concluded. Heather accepted the envelope with trembling hands. No one raised a voice. No one celebrated. The consequences had arrived through policy instead of emotion. Naomi looked at Heather for a quiet moment before speaking. One decision rarely changes a life by itself, she said. It is the pattern behind that decision that determines where the path leads. I hope this becomes the day you choose a different path. Heather lowered her eyes, holding the unopened envelope as the full weight of the morning finally settled upon her. 3 months later, the leadership auditorium at Brooks Global Aviation was filled with employees from every department, from executives and pilots to maintenance technicians and new trainees attending their first company orientation. Naomi Brooks stood at the front of the room, wearing the same quiet confidence that had carried her through the events of that unforgettable flight. There were no luxury displays behind her, no dramatic presentation, only a large screen showing a single sentence. Respect begins before recognition. The audience remained completely silent as Naomi looked across the room. Many people have asked why I did not immediately announce who I was that day, she began. The answer is simple. If I had introduced myself as the owner the moment I boarded, everyone would have behaved professionally because of my position. I wanted to know whether they would behave professionally because it was the right thing to do. The room remained still. Every employee understood that she was speaking about something much larger than one incident. Naomi continued, titles should never determine who deserves courtesy. Wealth should never determine who receives dignity. Appearance should never determine who is believed. The standard must remain the same for every person who walks through our doors. Emily sat near the front of the auditorium, now wearing the badge of a fully certified cabin supervisor after completing an accelerated leadership program. She listened carefully, remembering the moment she chose to verify the manifest instead of accepting assumptions. That single decision had shaped her career and her understanding of leadership forever. Captain Daniel Mercer was also present. Following the executive review, he had accepted responsibility for allowing conclusions to replace verification during those first critical minutes. Instead of denying his mistake, he had helped redesign crew procedures that required objective confirmation before escalating passenger disputes whenever circumstances allowed. The new policy was now being adopted throughout the company's entire flight operation. Heather Collins was no longer employed by Brooks Global Aviation. The independent review concluded that the issue extended beyond one conversation and reflected repeated failures to uphold company standards of professionalism and impartial treatment. Naomi never spoke publicly about Heather again. She believed accountability belonged inside fair processes, not public humiliation. As the meeting drew to a close, one of the newest employees raised a hand. What is the most important quality a leader can have? Naomi smiled gently before answering. The willingness to see the person before the assumption. She allowed the words to settle before continuing. Every day we meet people whose stories we do not know. Some arrive wearing expensive suits. Others arrive wearing simple clothes. Some speak with confidence. Others remain quiet. None of those details tell us their worth. Character reveals itself through actions, not appearances. The auditorium filled with thoughtful silence before applause slowly spread from one side of the room to the other until everyone was standing. Naomi looked across the audience with quiet gratitude. She knew the real victory had never been proving who owned an aircraft. The real victory was creating a culture where the next person, regardless of race, background, clothing, or status, would never have to prove they deserved basic respect before receiving it. As the employees left the auditorium, the sentence on the screen remained unchanged, serving as a reminder that true leadership is never measured by the authority someone possesses, but by the dignity they extend to people who have nothing to offer in return. And that lesson became the legacy Naomi Brooks hoped would outlast every airplane, every title, and every success she would ever achieve.